This is a debate between Ash Maiz, a former Orthodox Jew, now Catholic Christian, I believe, and Yehuda Yisrael, a counter-missionary, Orthodox Jew. And they're going to try to have a conversation, see where they can agree, and try to move forward from there. I'm going to offer a little analysis and some commentary to clarify some things as we go. I'm going to try to clarify it from both standpoints, but then at the end, I'm going to give my own opinion on the debate, and you'll be able to draw your own conclusions, and we'll talk about it. Hey, before I start, please subscribe, like, share, and comment so I can know what's going on in your head. You know, we have a discussion about this. All right.
I like to, talk about points of agreement between us.
Okay.
When I go to Messianic prophecy, right, between Jews and Christians, I would imagine we both agree that one of the primary sources, I would say the primary source of who the Messiah is supposed to be, comes from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16, which obviously in the immediate context speaks about a son of David who will eventually establish the kingdom of David.
What we want to establish here, or what Yehuda wants to establish, is that there's got to be common ground in order for us to have a conversation. You couldn't have like a conversation or a discussion where we both rely on something that the other side won't agree with. If you're talking with an atheist, for example, and you say God created the world, and he says, no, he didn't, and he goes, he did, and he goes, well, what's your evidence? You say, the Bible. Well, the atheist isn't going to care about that piece of evidence because it's not something that he believes in or holds to be true. So the same thing is going to happen in debate between Jews and Christians, is that if you want to have an impact on the other person, you've got to argue from a common ground. That's just a basic consideration. And to have any kind of relevant conversation, no matter what the topic is, you've got to find common ground with your opponent. And that common ground is the Tanakh, the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures. And that's exactly where they're going to start from in 2 Samuel 7.
And ultimately a son, obviously King Solomon is being spoken about in the immediate context when it says he shall build a house in my name and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Right. We also understand
two parts to prophecy, right?
Right. We also understand that can also refer to the future Messiah, who of course will ultimately establish that throne through that eternal promise.
Yehuda's conceding the idea that we can have an immediate contextual plain meaning understanding of a verse that's in a whatever time period, if there is a restricted time period that applies to, and then potentially we can also apply it, I think I would say on a lesser level on another time period, or maybe an equivalent one. Yehuda's doing this to remove a big problem that happens when Christians and Jews debate, and that is whether or not we would spend our time arguing about how we can use the verses. How can we use the verses? For example, if we can this verse refer to both King David in 7:12, for example, 2 Samuel 7:12? Can this refer to King David and his son Solomon? That's the immediate context. And can it also apply potentially to the Mashiach, to the Messiah? And it can potentially be applied to both. Now, one of them is the context, the immediate context, the plain meaning. So he's open to it being applied to the Messiah. But here's the caveat you have to keep in mind. If you want a proof text by taking it from the immediate usage and moving it to a different time and not ignoring the context of the chapter and verse, now what you've done is you've weakened a proof text, and the best it can become then at that point is like a hint or something. Now that's not said just to be able to establish common ground and to move on and start finding out where we agree and where we don't agree. So both of them, it looks like, are kind of going along with this right now. And, and look, it is a concession on Yehuda's part. That's, a lot of Jews won't make that concession when we debate with Christians. So Yehuda's doing that.
Right. I don't know. Do you have any qualms with that as being like a
do you
foundational text?
Do you want to bring it up on the screen? So 7, 12.
The second
Yeah.
Samuel 7:12.
Yeah, when your days are done and you rest with your ancestors, you raise up your offspring after you. Right. So that's the son of David, right? In the immediate context, because then it says, I will be a father to him and he shall be a son to me. And then it even talks about like when he does wrong, I will chastise him. Right. So obviously the pshat of that wouldn't be about, at least from a Christian point of view, not about the Messiah, because it's talking about this son being, a sinner effectively. So we understand that as Solomon. I think Christianity doesn't have a problem with that either. But then it says, I will never withdraw my favor from him. So that's saying that it's going to be eternal, right? As opposed to the kingdom of Saul. And then it says, the kingdom shall be secure before you and your throne shall be established forever. I have no problem with that also applying to the future Messiah. That's fine, right? And I think Jews and Christians agree on this by and large.
Yeah, I think so.
Right.
I'm not particularly familiar with this as far as the messianic context, but I would say probably.
I think it's quoted in Hebrews chapter 1 when it says, I will be a father to him and he will be a son. So I'm pretty sure you can back check me on that, but
I'll take your word for it now, and we can just
right. I think it's like midrashically applied to,
right.
But
I'm just not going to pull them side by side because I don't.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So basically, I'm looking for that as criteria for messianic prophecy because that's where we both agree. So that's why I will go to Hosea 3 verses 4 and 5, right, to establish, a Davidic king who will rule at the end of days, effectively, right? When it says the Israelites will go for a long time without a king, without officials, without sacrifice, without cult, without pillars, without ephod, without oracle or idols. That's Hosea chapter 3, verse 4. And then it says afterward, the Israelites will turn back and see the eternal God and David, their king, and they will come to, God and over God's bounty in the days to come, right? Or they will effectively, in the future, they will come to not just God, but also David, their king. And that uses that sort of end times language of where it says, Acharit Hayamin, which is similar to like the eternal kingdom. So I think both Christians and Jews also agree that would refer to the Messiah when it says David, their king in Hosea 3:5.
So he's setting the groundwork for expanding this idea where we can use the same verse having an immediate plain meaning context and then a secondary usage that you can apply for the Messiah. Not a perhaps literal usage because you're taking it kind of out of its context, but one that's useful to paint a picture and giving you some idea. There's language in there that can indicate that. So here he's tying this 2 Samuel 7 to Hosea 3:5, and he's in that case it's a end time prophecy, and in the case of 2 Samuel, this is at the period of time that's happening with King David. That's in his time period. The Hosea 3:5 prophecy is the Messianic era because that's the language of it, and at that time. So the Hosea is saying there's going to be a long time where Israel will not have a priest or a king, and then in the end days or the later days, they're going to turn back to God and David their king, and so they're going to have that. They're going to have the king and the priest, and they're going to and David then becomes a term that it can be used for the Messiah. So we have David as the term used for Messiah, and then we have the idea of the son of David. So we use that both of those as being trigger words for Messiah, So we see that happening in Ezekiel 37. So, so this is just expanding on what they already agreed to earlier. And the thing is that if Ash agrees to what Yehuda is saying here, the implication is Yehuda could turn back around and say, well, look, there are many days there is no king of Israel and no priesthood. So you can't. So number one, you can't attack the Jews for not having a king or a priesthood, and not having priesthood in the sense there are no priests to serve in the temple. We still have our priesthood, but and that's the case, then that would seem to imply that there is no need for a first coming when it comes to having a priest. You can't use the argument of no priest and no king as evidence that you need a first coming and then you'll need a second coming. So if that is a trap that he's laying, then it's a pretty good one. But we'll see how Ash responds to this
in that end of days context. Any
Okay.
qualms with that?
Nope. We can keep going from there.
Yeah, we can. I just wanted to emphasize the timeline, at least, and I understand there's.
So Yehuda's laid it out. Ash doesn't have a problem with that. So that's potentially opened him up to falling into that trap. Now I'm saying trap, but it is like both sides are doing trap. This is a friendly discussion, but at the end of the day, are Ash Maiz and Yehuda uninterested in convincing people of their position? Are they uninterested in winning the debate? Are they right? No, they're having this debate because they want to convince somebody, whether it's each other or someone in the audience. Both of them want to convince somebody that what they believe is true. That's why they have these kinds of discussions. If you didn't care, you just want to talk about these things.
Discrepancies in other places where between Jews and Christians on this, but at least looking at this particular timeline, it says there's going to be a time when Israel does not have a king and does not have a sacrifice.
Right.
And prior to that time, right, the Messiah isn't here yet. At least looking at that base value according to the Pshat. Right. So that's why.
You're saying, so if I'm understanding correctly, because it says there will be a long time without a king and without sacrifice,
mm-hmm.
and then the Messiah will come.
Right.
Okay. And so I'm guessing that from there you'd say that because Jesus came while the temple was still standing, that would mean that Jesus can't fulfill that prophecy?
I'm saying that it lends credibility to the position that there's not a necessity that the Messiah needs to come before the destruction of the second temple. And I can provide corroborating evidence for that in Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 24 through 28,
going back
for example.
A step, can it apply to different timelines? So, for example, prophecy as we...
So let me pause that real quick before we get into the timeline question. Ash has caught on to the potential implications of agreeing to what Yehuda's saying. And now he's going to do it. He's doing a little bit of pushback, clarification, which is good. You want to clarify what is your position, where you're going with this. Because the implication is that you could say, that you don't, the expectation is we don't see the Messiah until the end of days, until the era of the Messiah, right? When all the wonderful things happen. And Yehuda's taking a slightly weaker standpoint. He's saying, no, look, at least what I'm saying is, Christians say the Messiah had to come before the destruction of the second temple. Christians say that. I'm saying this verse in Hosea doesn't say that. It's telling us actually he doesn't have to. There's no requirement that the Messiah shows up before the destruction of the second temple. And that's a discussion on Daniel 9. So he's not going all the way and saying that it precludes a first coming, Messiah coming in the second temple period, but it does say that there's no strong reason that he has to appear, because we know that he appears in the Messianic age. There's nothing that's forcing us to agree with Christians on the interpretation they have on Daniel 9. So I think we're going to have a little more pushback on this because this is very important. Maybe this is where Ash is going on this question of timelines. When they say timelines, I'm assuming they mean like time periods.
We said can apply to multiple timelines, right? They can apply to multiple things. It's like some are temporal, literal things that are happening, and some things are later on. So if Jesus comes in the second coming after a long time without temple and sacrifice, why does that have him not fulfilling the other prophecies about coming before the end of the second temple?
If he comes, you're saying if he comes twice effectively? Is that what you're saying?
Right. A lot of Christianity is based on the idea that he says, I will come again, right?
Right, of course. I'm not saying that what I'm saying is that the evidence based on the standards that we establish of a Davidic king who will rule at the end of days, the explicit texts, right, that say a Davidic king who will rule, the indication that's why I was going to show corroborating evidence for that. In Ezekiel 37, it uses similar language to what it uses in Hosea 3, using that same eternal, saying, it says, my servant David shall be king over them, and one shepherd shall be for all of them, and they will walk in my ordinances, right? And then it says, they will dwell in the land forever, right? And they shall know that I am the Lord. So it's very similar language that is used regarding that Davidic king who will rule, and then it's saying God will also be, obviously, dwelling with Israel.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Where are we going?
24 through 38. Or it's 24 through 28, sorry. There's not 38 verses in Ezekiel.
My servant David shall be king over them. Okay, and I like Sepharia because we have the Hebrew side by side, right?
Well, we should go a few verses before. Let me go a little bit before to 20. You'll notice it's talking about the ingathering of the exiles, right? So that it's the same timeline idea. It doesn't say the king's going to come and then you're going to miss the king, right? It just says you're going to be in exile.
So Yehuda is Ash asked the appropriate question. Ash pushed back a little bit for clarification. He said, I don't see how this means that Jesus can't come twice, which Yehuda's not saying he can't come twice. But what he is saying is, he's saying, number one, there's no reason that the Messiah has to come twice. We know that he only needs to show up in the period of the ingathering of the Jewish people, that the end of what we call normal history, I suppose. And that's when he has to show up. That's the only one where where the Messiah has to show up. He doesn't have to show up earlier. And so that weakens the Christian claim. So he's just strengthening that we have two verses or two sections of text that in their plain meaning, it's very clear that we're talking about in the time of the ingathering, and that they both say pretty much the same thing. And that's going to be relevant because the emphasis is not the Messiah coming earlier than the ingathering, but the emphasis is on the Messiah coming during the ingathering. So if you want to strengthen then the position that the Messiah has to come or did come, you've got to find, Ash would need to find corroborating verses on that point. Now you would say, well, we have it. It's called, Daniel 9. But again, Yehuda's already made the argument that although you could make a claim for two comings, maybe you could make a claim for two comings, but look, the evidence seems to be the Messiah showing up in the latter days when with the ingathering of the Jewish people. So Ash Daniel 9 is not sufficient, and let's forget the fact that both sides have very differing views on the timeline that Daniel 9 offers and disagreement on how it to be interpreted. That just getting there is an entirely different conversation. But the point is Yehuda's laying out very clearly, we have evidence the Messiah definitely comes, and when it comes to when must the Messiah come, that is in the period of the ingathering of the exiles. Coming before that, maybe he could. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying there's nothing that says he has to.
So I'm just trying to corroborate using this golden thread of Davidic king, rule at the end of days, right? From 2 Samuel, and then seeing, okay, Hosea 3, that matches with that, and it seems to indicate a timeline that the Messiah will come at the end of days. Then you do Ezekiel, okay, Davidic king, also will rule at the end of days, right? My sanctuary will be in their midst forever. That's the end of the chapter, right? And Ezekiel 37:28. But it's the same thing. It's my servant David will be king over them, right? And it seems to make this distinction between the Davidic king and the Lord their God, as well as the same timeline is emphasized. So that would be, I think I'm trying to come at this from a point of view where we can both agree on a standard, right? Instead of like just kind of slinging verses at each other, where the, you see what I'm saying? Like, yeah. So I don't know exactly how much time I have left. I'm probably going to have to leave in like 5 minutes. So I just wanted to.
I would agree with you 100%. I think this is why we can have a proper conversation about this, right? Unlike certain other individuals on both sides. I don't think you can versify the Bible and sling verses, just like you just said. That's true. You have to look at the entire narrative. I don't see why this would invalidate Jesus as the Messianic king.
I think that it would require, because the issue is that I find this to be, because there's mutual understanding between you and me on these verses, that the timeline and how it is understood, none of these verses, and we can go through more if you want, but based on the
right, but what I'm saying is, don't you have more of an issue overall that forgetting timeline, because timeline shifts throughout prophecy, right? That anyone can make claims about when it applies to what timeline. You'd have to just base your tradition on that, right? Because timeline can shift rapidly when we're talking about biblical prophecy.
I think Ash is correct that sometimes it's very difficult to tie down the time frame of certain biblical prophecies. It's very, you can say that maybe it happens in this era, maybe it happens in that era. So when it comes to prophecy, sometimes that is very difficult. And that's why there's a lot of disagreement even within like Jewish commentators and possibly Christian commentators. But there are some that it's not unclear. And that's what Yehuda has established here, which is it's not unclear that if you want to say, when must the Messiah appear, he must appear in the end of days, the period of time, the era of the ingathering of the exiles. That has got to be when the Messiah appears. 2,000 years before, right? There's nothing that says the Messiah has to appear at that time. There is no evidence that has to happen. And so what Yehuda has done is he has laid out, and he wants to lay out a chain of verses that say the same thing, and that is, for sure the Messiah has to come in the period of the ingathering of Israel, and that the messianic conversation about the Messiah, that's when he's always talked about. For sure, that is when he's talked about. Prior appearances of the Messiah, that is something that you would have to build a case for, just like Yehuda built a case scripturally, and is trying to build a case scripturally for the end times period when the Messiah must appear. Christians must build a scriptural argument for why the Messiah must appear in the end of the Second Temple period. And other than Daniel 9, I don't know that that's possible to make that kind of argument. And even then, that then goes into its own debate. He's pushing back on this. It seems not from the strength of verses that say, no, there are verses that show that the Messiah has to come up, has to appear at the end of the second period. What he's actually arguing here is that the prophets are vague. So the only way that you can really pin down when the Messiah is supposed to come is according to your tradition. Your tradition as a Jew and my tradition as a Christian. So that is the first step away from the discussion on Scripture. Now, I don't know if this is his intention to say this, that he's intentionally moving away from that discussions. Discussions, debates can be very organic, but it is a clear indication that he's lacking the background of the Scriptures. He's lacking the strength to rely on the Scriptures. He doesn't have scriptural evidence to rely on, I think, from his standpoint. So that's why he's abandoned a scriptural argument and is now going for more of a, the Bible's vague. That causes a lot of problems. If you take that position, that causes a lot of problems for you. Because it removes the force of which you could claim any scriptures has if you admit that it's vague. You've at the very least got to point out which verses are vague. You can't just make it sort of an overarching statement about all verses are vague. You have to say, well, there's certain verses that are vague. What Yehuda's laying out is not vague, right? Maybe he doesn't say in the year 2025, that's when the Mashiach has to come. Maybe that's, maybe it's not strong to that point, but it is giving you an era in which to expect the Messiah. The Messiah must appear in an era where you have the ingathering of the exiles.
But in terms of the content of the prophecy, even if we were to say that none of the timeline stuff even mattered, right? Because it for you it validates, for me it validates, for you it invalidates. I don't even think that's why I say, I think that a lot of people on the Messianic Jewish side, on the evangelical side, in the apologetics, they make a big mistake of focusing on what the Jewish equivalent world thing would be of gematria. You know what I mean? I found a cool thing that says what I wanted to say, so therefore it points to what I want to point it to. Just like somebody, I had a funny story of somebody telling me they don't eat, I forget which nut it is. They said they don't eat that on Pesach because egos is the gematria of chametz.
Right, it's like a loose, it's not.
Forgetting they got the gematria. Forget the gematria.
I'm not entirely sure where he's going with this. It seems a little off topic. He's gotten distracted with something. In my experience in talking with Christians, I do see this kind of thing happen, where there's a point where the Christian doesn't really know what the answer is. Maybe to give themselves some time to kind of think about where they want to go with the discussion, they'll bring up something kind of random, and you're like, well, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? If he's trying to say that people using gematria to say there's a certain kind of thing he can and can't eat for Pesach, right, is the same as, the prophecies can be vague. I don't think that's relevant. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think that you can examine those on the same level at all. So it just seems kind of like a random point that he's making here. And maybe this is just giving himself some mental breathing room to know where he's going to go next. So we'll see.
I didn't actually add up to that, but it's a very ridiculous way to base your halachic observance from a Jewish perspective. But massive parts of the Jewish world do that, and massive parts of the evangelical Christian world, Messianic Jews, based on they think that a little thing that from a verse that points to something in one context is all the proof they need for their entire worldview. Right. And you and I both disagree with that. The content here, though, is that the Messianic king of David's line is an eternal ruler.
Okay, so I think this was a breathing room argument, is what he was giving us, a breathing room argument. And that what he wants to say now is he wants to talk about the Messiah as eternal, a Messiah as God. That's where he wants to push this thing out. Now notice, he hasn't given his argument for why the Messiah has to come in the first temple, which is, Yehuda's made the argument for why he must come in the time of the ingathering. It's very clear scriptures. There's no vagueness to that. But instead of going back with that, of course, now he's going into this direction of, well, the Messiah must be eternal. Okay, so let's see what verses he offers to make that argument.
Right. When God says so many times, only I will rule you. And the Messianic king is a redeemer. When God says so many times, only I will redeem you. In Daniel 7, has a son of man, one like a son of man, which is very interesting way to phrase it, like a son of man who comes on, the clouds, and all dominion and glory is given to him, and his kingdom is forever. And I know we've talked about this, the Kadishei Elyonin, like the saints of the Holy One, but it's plural, but that's not the point here. The saints of the Holy One are part of the kingdom. They get the kingdom, but they're not given dominion over the kingdom like the Son of Man several verses earlier, which is a very big thing. Like, worship and dominion is not given eternally to a person in God's kingdom. Can we agree that that's a very odd thing, that if you were reading the Bible from a context of no Judaism, no Christianity, you might end up with some kind of paganism?
That's a really weird stretch for him to go to. Like, to go to say, isn't it true that Christianity and Judaism, minus the traditions of either Christianity or Judaism, the Tanakh might be able to be interpreted as polytheistic? Now, he brought up Daniel 7, and that's really interesting because Daniel 7 is used by those who want to say that this whole event is something that is pagan. And so this is one of the examples they use, is Daniel 7, regarding why some academians, some secular scholars think that the Tanakh is actually a secular document, and not a secular document, or not, I'm sorry, not a secular document, a document of a pagan or polytheistic document. So where he's going with this sounds like he's saying you need tradition to not be a pagan or a polytheist. That's what it sounds like he's saying. That's a really dangerous thing to say. Like, I mean, I would be desperate. I mean, I guess I would think you'd have to be kind of desperate to make that argument. Like, that's a pretty hard, that's just saying, Yehuda, the truth of the matter is that you're trying to build up this argument based on the scriptures alone, but you know what? If we only go by the scriptures alone, they sound kind of pagan. That's really, I don't know. I'd be very hesitant to make that kind of argument. Let's see how he develops it.
You're saying based on what Daniel 7 says?
Based on what Daniel 7 says, based on what's described of God throughout the Tanakh. If you were to read with no lens at all of any tradition, you could very easily get to being like, there's guys that have whole channels that are dedicated to how the Bible is really just another pagan text, right? And they're not wrong if you read it without any tradition or context, right?
Well, like,
wow. So he's saying they're not wrong. If you don't read with the context, what's the context? Not the scriptures, but your traditions, your Christian tradition or your Jewish tradition. If you don't have a Jewish or Christian tradition, you're left with a pagan document. That's what he's saying. That's amazing. So, and this is a huge shift in the conversation. This is what this is demonstrating is that Yehuda's attempt to establish common ground didn't work. There is no common ground because no Jew would really ever say, yeah, it's a pagan document without our traditions. In fact, Yehuda hasn't brought up the traditions at all yet, the Jewish traditions. And he's been interpreting it. And he's not going to say that, yeah, we really do need the Jewish traditions in order to interpret. That's just a big mess. I don't know. I wouldn't go there. I think this is a very dangerous argument he's making here. Dangerous because, first off, he honestly, I don't know how to respond to his claim here. It's a pretty dangerous argument. People should be very wary of these kind of arguments because you are conceding so much territory to people who are antagonistic towards the belief in God. And not only that, you're now corrupting. He's making the argument because he's got to go and he's got to deal with this issue. He's got to make it so that the Trinity is the only solution to this problem that he's created now. And that it's a desperate problem. And it's so desperate that you've got to have some sort of solution. You want to be a monotheist. Christians say they're monotheists. Jews are strict monotheists. If you want to be a monotheist, you certainly can have your primary document be polytheistic. So you're going to need an explanation that takes care of the appearance of paganism and allows you to be monotheistic. And I think that's where he's going, but, I can see Christians, busting out of church saying, oh, well, great. It's the Bible's pagan. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I hope not. I mean, that's hyperbole, I suppose, on my part. But it's scary.
Like I said, when it comes to this sort of debate, right, you're obviously trying to sort of skip the middleman, get to the point where the Messiah is God, right? For me, when I read all of these verses that I showed you, none of them indicate, at least the verses that I was bringing up, that we both agree refer to the Messiah.
But
like, for example,
that's why Christianity points to a totality of things that point to the Messiah and who he is.
Right, but it's interesting that we agree on these when it says, "My servant David shall be king over them." Right? It doesn't say, "I David, chas v'shalom, I, the God of Israel," right? Who is also known as David, their king, right?
Can we agree because of that if you're going to be a Christian and believe in Jesus, you can only be a Trinitarian Christian?
Wow, like that's a pretty big. I know I'm trying to give analysis and explain what's going on, but this is kind of shocking. Like, so he's saying that unless you're Trinitarian, right? Here's what's going on. Yehuda just pointed out, hey, I've got verses here. It doesn't say that, God is the Messiah. God is the King Messiah. It says David's the King Messiah. It doesn't say, God forbid, like he said, that I, the God of Israel, am also King David. It doesn't say that. It says, my servant David. I don't understand how he's trying to put these together, because it's very clear that God is distinct from my servant David. It's very clear from the verses that are quoted here. But to then say that this therefore demonstrates that you can only be a Trinitarian to be a Christian, that doesn't demonstrate that at all. In fact, I think what it demonstrates is that the exact opposite. That it's the very opposite of what he's saying. That God and David are separate. If you agree that King David represents the Messiah, and you read that verse and he says, I will be their God, my servant David, right? Not me, shall be the king over them. He doesn't say me, I'll be king over them. No, he says King David will be. That seems to indicate that the Messiah is not God, number one. And there's no plurality to David, and there's no connection between the Messiah and King David. So it actually demonstrates the opposite of what he wants to say. If you take this scripture seriously, you can't be a Trinitarian. You cannot be a Trinitarian. So I don't know. This is a, like, I felt he was doing so well at the beginning. It's still fairly courteous, but now he's kind of in trying to get away. I think he's trying to escape from the scriptures, really, and keeps making this argument about you need to have your tradition in order to understand the scriptures, right? The totality of Christianity. And totality means, I think, anything from the Old Testament, New Testament, archaeology, science, philosophy. All these elements are the totality of Christianity, I would assume, because Christians will use philosophy. So all these things are, I think, he wants to just throw it in the lump category of tradition. And now it makes sense that Ash is really pushing tradition because he's a Catholic. But what about those Christians out there who aren't Catholics and are Trinitarians? Ash has sort of thrown them under the bus, right? He's saying, look, you want to be a good Trinitarian, you can only do that as a Catholic. You can only be a good Trinitarian as a Catholic, because you require the traditions that are outside of you can't just have the Old Testament. You also have to have the traditions of Christianity. And that's a Catholic argument. And so would a Protestant agree with what he's saying here right now? I can't imagine. I think the Protestant would go along with Yehuda saying. The Protestant would say, you know what? No, I believe that the Old Testament can be read on its own and stand on its own and say there's one God. As far as the Trinitarian argument, I don't know how they would argue that, but they would say, whatever our beliefs are, they all have to come from the Scripture. And they would reject this idea of tradition because they're not really in the same sense as Catholics. I know that to some extent there are certain traditions they kind of rely on and might admit to, but this is a huge thing. You can't. I think it would be highly improbable for a non-Catholic Trinitarian to agree with Ash Maiz's argument that that you can't just read the Bible as it is. You need some sort of external tradition to make it monotheistic. Do you think I'm being am I misunderstanding him here? Or, what would you I'm sure there are some Protestants watching this. Do you agree with what he's saying? Do you believe that the Scriptures can't stand on their own? They need some sort of tradition. In that case, then the battle for monotheism is between Jews and Catholics.
Meaning Hebrew Israelites, Unitarian Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons. Like, you can't find, like, if you're going to be believing in Jesus, you have to be a Trinitarian Christian, right? Because there has to be the separate persons of the Trinity in order for that to make sense at all. Can we agree on that?
I mean, that's an in-house debate, I guess, amongst Christians. Like, you can claim that. I'm not going to claim to be an authority on your belief. I know you're new to the belief system, but
not an authority that you're claiming to be. But from your perspective, the only way that could make sense from what you just said, because it's saying my servant David about the Messiah. If the Messiah is being referenced as a divine figure, and God is talking about the Messiah, but the Messiah is then given the worship of God, you can only, if you're going to believe that Jesus is this figure, you can only be a Trinitarian.
Well, you're saying if, I don't see where, like, because obviously
I'm
when
saying
you
if somebody takes the New Testament at face value, they'd have to be a Trinitarian Christian.
So Yehuda's right. That's an internal Christian debate, but he's really just trying to convince Yehuda, and I guess people in the audience that, we've just solved the problem of there being other types of Christians who aren't Trinitarians. We've just solved that problem. Here it is. Here's that problem. It's funny. I feel like I've sort of abandoned my attempt at trying to be impartial in this. And that's because Ash says some shocking things. I mean, I'm like, I'm shocked that he would say some of the things that he says. And but to make this, like, why is he trying to push this idea on Yehuda? Why is he trying to say, Yehuda, don't you agree that, you have to be a Trinitarian if you're going to, take the New Testament at face value? Why does this matter to him? Well, I think it's because he's sort of plodding along with an argument, and I think he's setting a trap here for Yehuda, and I think he's being very disingenuous at this point. The trap he's trying to set for Yehuda is, if you kind of walk through the steps of what he's been arguing, and we'll just start with the point where he says, if the people out there, the atheist, secular, academians, archaeologists, historians who read the Bible see a pagan book. They see polytheism, plurality. They've got a point. If you don't have a Christian or Jewish tradition, how can you be a monotheist? That's his first step. because of the polytheism that is lurking in the Old Testament, a Christian who claims to be a monotheist can't escape that polytheism and remain as a monotheist unless they are Trinitarian, because that means one God with three persons. So you've got one, and then you've got more than one. That seems to be what he's trying to say for them. Agree with this, Yehuda, he says. So if Yehuda agrees with this, if he agrees with Ash, what's the trap? Well, the trap is that once Yehuda agrees with this statement, then he goes, Yehuda, you know what? You also can't explain this polytheism away. You want to be a monotheist? Well, how do you explain away the polytheism that's obviously in the Old Testament? Therefore, the only way to maintain monotheism is by being a Trinitarian. And I think that's the trap. I think that's the argument he wants to make. So let's see if I'm right, and let's see if Yehuda falls for it or doesn't fall for it.
I don't, because I'd have to study the different heresies of Christianity and see if they make more compelling
Not
sense
even
than
heresy,
the Trinity.
just
Like
on face
modalism,
value.
like I'd have to
Right.
go into depth, like what does Arianism say? Like I don't know enough about the different quote unquote heretical sects of Christianity to make that, deduction as whether or not Trinitarianism would hypothetically make the most sense. What makes the most sense to me, according to the Peshat, is that the Messiah isn't God, because it says, my servant David shall be king over them. It doesn't say, I, the God David, right? That would be more obvious if you're trying to say that
But then you have
the Messiah is God.
God says, I alone redeem Israel, and then there's a redeemer. And
yeah, if you want to piecemeal verses, sure, I guess. But I mean, this verse and the verses that I regarding messianic prophecy,
get all the content of messianic prophecy together instead of just going, well, it says my servant, so he can't be talking about the second person of the Trinity.
I guess I was going off of our agreement from the beginning that the gold standard of criteria of messianic prophecy is that a Davidic king who will rule at end of days will be the Messiah, as opposed to let's look to a random verse that says I alone am God, and then
the claim is
king
that
over
Jesus is
Israel,
the
and then
Davidic
say
king.
like a king can only refer to the Messiah. Like King Saul was a king, but does that mean he's God? King David
why
was,
does so why does all of Jewish early literature refer to a king Messiah in verses that are referencing this very divine figure? Why do different Pirushim from various parts of Jewish history, right, refer to this figure in Daniel 7 as King Messiah?
Oh,
right?
because
Why
once
does the
again,
Talmud refer to the Son? By the way, it's very interesting because I've heard the claim that Psalm 2 saying "kiss the Son" is a Christian like distortion.
See, I'm not making these arguments.
Hold
like,
on,
I'm
the
not,
early church doesn't even translate it that way. That's actually Jewish
right.
translations
That's not
that
my,
evangelicals adopted.
That's not an argument that I make.
But it's obviously
Daniel
referring.
7,
You're obviously referring countless times to an eternal king that has existed from eternity, that has always existed. Even Jewish literature refers to a conversation with God and the Messiah before the creation of the world, right? Which lines up perfectly with the theology of the fact that it was the Word of God that became flesh, right? That's Midrashic literature that says that God had a conversation with the Messiah and told the Messiah that was pre-existent to creation that he's going to suffer for the sins of Israel. And
I mean, I can quote
conversation-
from, John 14:28 and say the Father is greater than I, and make a similar argument against, even Jesus claiming to be
the
God.
Father.
So
the
let's
Father-
stick with
the
the
Father-
text instead of going to
That is
rabbinic.
it. No, I'm happy to address that. The Father is greater in role than the Son within the Trinity. He eternally begets the Son.
Right.
There's
So
nothing wrong with that.
obviously,
So this is the kind of the maneuver is like he's trying to, even though Yehuda was being uncooperative and accepting what Ash was trying to push about you have to be a Trinitarian to be a Christian. Yehuda stood by. Let's go back to the scriptures. That's the point of our agreement. Let's make those arguments. We agreed that the Messiah has to come at the end of days. Okay? Let's stay within the points we agree with. But now Ash is going towards saying that all of the midrashic literature, all of the traditions of the Jews actually also point to the fact that the Messiah is eternal and is God. It's a huge leap. He's made a couple of huge leaps in this. So so there's some pushback, and so Ash Maiz is misrepresenting what Midrash says in these areas, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And Yehuda's saying, look, I can also misrepresent the New Testament. I'm going to go back and say, look, it says in John that, the Father is greater than I. Jesus says the Father is greater than I. Look at that. Obviously, you can't have Jesus God be lesser than Father God. It doesn't work like that. And so he goes, and so Ash goes, oh, I have an answer to that. And Yehuda goes, but I have an answer for what you just said. He said, that's not helpful. We are not getting anywhere in this conversation with me attacking your Christian tradition and you attacking my Jewish tradition. That's not getting us anywhere. The only way we can get anywhere in this discussion is if we go back to what it is that we agree with one another on.
Midrashim are saying that the Messiah was the first creation. It's not saying that the Messiah is God. So I can address that as well.
Right, but it says before the creation of the world. What existed before the creation of the world?
Once again, if it's a creation, then it's not God in the flesh. Like
it doesn't say he created the Messiah. It says the name of the Messiah was created before the world, and it says the Messiah was there before the creation of the world.
So once again, I can say that if he was a creation, which is what it goes under the category of,
why is that going
according to that, then that's the answer, just as you gave the answer saying that, well, he's greater than, whatever. Like,
so first off, Ash is being kind of lazy here. Maybe not lazy is a good word, but he's first off, he says, well, why does it say in the Old Testament all the time about, the Messiah doing things that only God should be able to do? And then he comes over to the Midrash and says, why does the Midrash talk about, the pre-existence eternality of the Messiah? But there are no verses given in the parts that talk about the Tanakh, and there's no reference to the Midrash. What Midrash is he talking about? Because there are actually, Midrashes that say that completely say not what he's claiming here. And I'll show you those in just a minute. I want to let them kind of finish this out and see, and then I'm going to show you these.
It's very easy to reconcile this if you think about it in the way, obviously the rabbis aren't saying the Messiah is God, because that's not the tradition.
You don't think that the pre-existent Messiah and Torah, the Logos of God, is telling at all from early rabbinic literature that the Torah and the Messiah pre-exist everything else?
Once again, what we're talking about is a creation. If a creation is the Torah God? Is like a physical Torah scroll, is that God?
Not the scroll of the Torah. The Torah is God's wisdom. You know what we're talking about.
Right, but that's what I'm saying, is that you're sort of conflating ideas to try to say, like, look, rabbinic Judaism agrees with Christianity, and of course it doesn't.
That's the reverse. If I was saying,
stick with points of agreement.
If I was saying that the Torah scroll existed before creation, that would be absurd. So
then what are you saying? Like a physical human being named, like, the Messiah was sitting in heaven? Like, come on, like, you're saying something like,
right, I'm saying Christian theology.
But that's what I'm saying, is that you're.
So Yehuda lays it out. There's not a physical Torah scroll, right? So there's a physical Torah scroll that exists? Ash says, no, that's absurd. Oh, so then what are you talking about with the Messiah? A physical human being pre-existed and he's just floating there? Well, yes, that's what Christianity teaches. Then you're talking about a spiritual idea of Messiah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Messiah is pre-created or pre-existent. So, and I'm going to show you that, because this is the important point.
You're making excuses for when it says the Father is greater than I, and you're like, I have a perfect explanation. But then when I'm giving you an explanation, you're saying, no, that doesn't make any sense. And you have to understand it from a Christian paradigm, or else it's heresy or something. And it's just like, you got to give the same courtesy to the rabbinic explanations if you're going to bring them up. Because I didn't bring them up. Why? Like, I was bringing up the actual text, right?
Yehuda, now you don't like the way things are going, so you're putting words in my mouth. Don't do that.
Well, you were the one that brought in rabbinic texts into the conversation. I was arguing from a scriptural perspective, and then you strawmanned as usual, like a typical Christian that doesn't have an answer for me and decides
you're deteriorating. You're deteriorating because I pointed out that midrashic literature points to concepts.
I pointed out your double standard, and I showed you John 14:28, and you decided to bring up rabbinic literature, and now
Yehuda's right. Ash is strawmanning this whole the Jewish perspective. He has abandoned the scriptures, and he is attacking the midrash of the rabbis. And Ash is saying, you've got sour fruits because I happen to prove you wrong, and then I'm proving you're wrong. Now you're losing your temper because of it. I think that Yehuda is losing his temper because Ash has betrayed the spirit of this discussion. He has betrayed the idea that we can have an argument from the scriptures. Part of the reason why that Ash has done this is because he's a Catholic. Are non-Catholic Trinitarians going to get on board with Ash and say, you're right, we need external traditions from the scriptures to prove the Trinity? Or are you going to say the Trinity can be demonstrated from the scriptures? Ash wants to establish that it's tradition, not our interpretation of the scriptures, that allows us to have a correct view of God and God's plan for the world. Isn't that what the Protestants rejected? With the aid of the printing press saying every man should have a Bible, every man can read the Bible, every man can understand the Bible? Isn't that the perspective of Protestants and perhaps others? I don't know all the different versions of Christianity. But he is pushing, he's trying to convince two different groups of people. He's trying to convince his audience that Jews have crazy midrash, and that honestly, even the rabbis sort of suspect that what Christianity is claiming as far as the Trinity goes is true. And on the other hand, he's also trying to deal with, I guess there's really 3 points, all the non-Trinitarians. You have to be a Trinitarian in order to be able to correctly believe in God, according to believe in the New Testament even. And then he's trying to also bamboozle the Protestants out there who have an interest in proving Judaism wrong and bringing in Jewish converts into Christianity by making this argument of tradition trumps scripture. Are you going to allow him to do that? Do you agree with this? Like, there are a lot of Christians. Christianity is not like this. There's one belief about everything, right? There are so many different streams of Christian thought that exist out there. And Ash is trying to sweep them all up and putting them into two simple groups and then just kind of like, swat them off the table. Like they were no big deal. Swat them off the table. And, he's doing all of this, and he has abandoned the nature of the conversation. He is being disingenuous. And I feel Yehuda's frustration. It makes me upset as well that this is the way he's chose to go about this. So if you're a Catholic, I guess you love what Ash is doing here. But I can't imagine the rest of the Christians out there agree with this.
Oh, you don't want to play
Okay.
ball anymore. So
Play ball
I
with what?
can play because I just showed you.
Play
You're
ball with what?
using what you're doing is taking rabbinic literature out of context.
I'm
You're
not
trying to
taking it out
make
of
it
context.
appear as
I'm not
though
taking it out of
it's
context.
validating your points, and then I'm using the same strategy in the New Testament to show you.
I'm not taking
Actually,
it out
you
of
are doing
context.
something
So
hypocritical by bringing those up. So if
Can
we
I
go to Hosea
rephrase?
3:5, right?
No. Can I
It says a Davidic
rephrase what I
king.
said?
Right.
Can I rephrase what I said because you put words in
What
my
I'm
mouth?
saying is that let's go to points of agreement, my friend. That's what I'm saying.
Hold on, but we disagree on things about those points of agreement, so that's what a disagreement
Okay,
is.
then you started talking about things that had nothing to do with what I brought up.
Okay, because we're talking about the totality of Jewish culture,
Yes.
Scripture, Christian culture. We're talking about all of it together.
Right.
Right? We don't
So
want
we
to
agree
we don't
then
want
that
to
a
verse swing
Davidic
here,
king who will
right?
rule at the end of days
You tried to make a rule of no
the
verse
standard,
swinging.
and then you started talking about
Okay.
something completely different
Right. Because I'm looking at
you
the
didn't like the
totality.
standard and you
So again, he's making a Catholic argument for all this. Like, I don't think there's much point in. There's like a minute or two left over, and it's really just, he's telling, he's telling Yehuda that he's filibustering the conversation, and Yehuda's saying I'm not, and we're going back and forth on that point. So I want to deal with some of the things that he's talking about with the Midrash. The Midrash, he wants to talk about things that were created, pre-created, or not created. He says the Messiah, the name of the Messiah was. So here we have Bereshit Rabbah 1:1, I believe. In the beginning, God created. That is the first verse of Genesis, about the first half of it. 6 items preceded the creation of the world. Some of them were actually created, and some of them God contemplated creating. So there were some things out of those 6 that were created and existed before the creation of the world. And then there were some things that weren't created, but he contemplated, he thought about creating them before the creation of the world. So what are those? The Torah and the throne of glory were created. So the Torah and the throne of glory, those 2 were created. Now he gives some, the Midrash talks about where we get this idea from. But I want to go down. The patriarchs, Israel, the temple, and the name of the Messianic king, God contemplated creating them before the world, but did not. Ash said, right? The Messiah was pre the creation of the world. He already existed. But the Messiah wasn't even created according to Bereshit Rabbah 1. If you're going to use the Midrash, use it right. Quote it correctly. Here it is. Bereshit Rabbah says the Messiah was not created before the creation. It says it there black and white. That is a refutation of his Midrashic argument. And it's not even the Messiah himself that is God contemplated, didn't actually create, that God contemplated creating. It was the name of the Messiah. Perkins of Rabbi Eliezer, 32. This is another Midrash. Okay, 6 people, right? This is verse 1. 6 people were called by their names before they were created. And they are Isaac, Ishmael, Moses, Solomon, Josiah, and King Messiah. 6 people were called by their name before they were created. Before they were created. So, at some point, these individuals did not exist, but they were called by those names. Again, this gives we know the Messiah did not exist before the creation of the world. Just like Isaac, Ishmael, Moses, Solomon, and Josiah did not exist before the creation of the world, neither did King Messiah. And it wasn't even, it was their names, they were called by these names before they existed. So their names preceded them. This is in the Talmud, Pesachim 54:1. 54 Aleph, It all stands for one side. The other side of the page is called bait. Wasn't it taught in a Braita, 7 phenomena were created before the world was created? And they are Torah and repentance, the Garden of Eden, and Gehenna, which is hell, and the throne of glory, and the temple, and the name of Messiah. So here, there is a disagreement between the previous ones that says that the name was only contemplated in being created, wasn't actually created. So here, Pesachim is saying that, no, the name of Messiah was created. But these things happened before the creation of the world, but these things are created. These 7 phenomenon are all created. Does that mean they're also God? Torah and repentance are God. Garden of Eden and Gehenna are God. The throne of glory is God. The temple of Messiah is God. If we're going to stick with what the Midrash says and look at it as authoritative, then I guess that's what you have to say. So there's a Trinity. There's at least 7 gods, and plus God himself. And they're created. I had to think Messiah skeptic, Yaakov, he gave the last one. And the other 2 came from some friends of mine who also have counter-missionary channels. You should not only subscribe to this station, but hit a like if you liked it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts with all of this discussion. Tell me what you think. Tell me who you thought won the debate. Tell me, do you agree with what Ash Maiz says? Do you agree with the Catholic argument that he made here? That he sort of brute forced a straw man into the debate, or you think that he did a pretty good job of being fair? Do you take the side of Yehuda? Do you think that he did a good job? I admit I would have liked to have heard Ash Maiz's re-explanation of what his points were. I don't know what those are, but but it seems like he made a very disingenuous move at the end. He just sort of, not even the end, I think it was sort of a planned build where he wanted to direct it. I've known very fair-minded Christians in the past. I've known a lot of people who pull stunts like this. And this is the way they debate. And like Yehuda said, let's start from an area where we agree. What do we agree on? Let's argue from that standpoint. Let's find the boundaries of which we agree on. And then we can really focus on areas we don't agree on. If you can, take a look at Yehuda Yisrael. I think you should subscribe to his station, Messianic Skeptic, Jawbone of Samson. If you speak Hebrew, then you can look at One God. Please subscribe here, like, comment, all that kind of stuff. See you next time.